Hi everyone, welcome to the Culinary Institute of America. My name is Robert Tremblay. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions here at the school, as well as a 2010 graduate. And today we're going to be talking about dumplings. Now, dumpling is really kind of a broad term when we talk about food. It comes in a lot of different variations, but in its simplest form, it's really just a small piece of dough or a small amount of batter that's cooked in a number of different ways. You can actually boil it, steam it, you can deep fry it if you want to. Believe it or not, in fact, a donut is actually a variation of a dumpling. So I know that's a little interesting to kind of think of because we normally think of dumplings as strictly just a savory application, but just about every culture in the world has some variation of a dumpling. They're very inexpensive to make, and there's a lot of different varieties that you can make out of it. You can fill them, you can do them as just the dough product themselves, you can add sauces to them and do a number of different elements. So what we're going to be making today is one of my all-time favorite dumplings, and that's the gnocchi. Now, gnocchi is unique because instead of just doing a straight flour, egg, and dairy mixture or water mixture for your dumpling recipe, it actually incorporates potato. And so coming from Italy, that's where the dish originates from. It's a way to utilize really day-old potatoes. So it's very much a peasant dish in that sense. What they were able to do is take the leftover potatoes that they had on hand, mash it up, and then extend with the ingredients that they were utilizing. And so with those potatoes, what you really want to look for is the moisture content. In this bowl, I've already got about a cup or so, about 5 to 6 ounces of pre-cooked potatoes. You can actually go about either boiling them in salted water, so you're incorporating some flavor and seasoning that way, or you can simply do them by roasting them in the oven. But what you're really ultimately looking for is a baked potato type consistency. So the more moisture that you have in your potatoes at this point is going to really have an impact on your consistency of your dough. So you really want to be mindful of that. If you do choose to boil your potatoes, I really suggest putting them back into your pot afterwards and giving them some residual heat that way to just dry them out a little bit and take out some of that extra moisture. But if you're roasting them, you should be pretty good to go. One trick that I like to use with regard to roasting them in the oven is that after they come out of the oven, you let them cool a little bit. If you slice them in half and then push them through a roasting rack onto a sheet tray that's underneath, very easy way to mash a lot of potatoes in a short amount of time. But you don't need to get too fine with your mashing. You could use a ricer, you could use a hand pulverizer, if you will, a potato masher that way. But really it's just a matter of making sure that your potatoes are cooked through properly and don't have a lot of residual moisture. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk through the rest of our ingredients for building the dumplings themselves. So in addition to the potato that we already have ready to go, we're also going to be using some AP flour. That's going to be the flour that we're going to be using. You could use more of a finer grained flour if you wanted to, like a semolina flour or something to that effect, but AP flour is just as easy to use for this. It allows you to not have to buy certain flours if you don't want to. It's just a little bit more accessible and simple to use. So the basic ratio that I put together for this is you're going to want about a cup of flour available per cup of potatoes. Now, in terms of weight, you're going to want about 4 to 5 ounces of flour on hand to about 4 to 5 ounces of cooked potatoes. So those are the ideas that you want to be working with, focusing on those ratios so that way you can extrapolate this to larger portions. So if we had to make this for 100 people as well as 4 or 5 people, we'd be making the same dish. It's just a matter of building those ratios to a larger amount so that way you remain consistent in the quality of your food. In addition to the flour, we're going to incorporate some whole egg to this as well. Again, we're sticking with the 1-to-1 ratio element with this. We're going to use 1 whole egg to the 1 cup of flour and the 1 cup of cooked potato. And then we also have some Pecorino Romano cheese that we're going to be adding later on. Okay. So now we're going to start to build our dough for the gnocchis before we start to roll them out and go through the rest of that process. So first and foremost, we're going to go ahead and season a little bit our potatoes. Now, like I said before, I actually boiled these ahead of time and I did them in a pot with really heavy seasoning in there. You really want your water to taste like the ocean, especially when you're working with a starch, so that way you get that seasoning all the way through your food. But we'll start off with a little bit of salt and pepper. We're going to keep this pretty straightforward in terms of our flavor profiles and our seasoning. We're going to go ahead and add in our whole egg to this. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to add some of our pecorino romano to this. Now, the pecorino romano is a great flavor profile to add into this because it's a very sharp, dry cheese, and so the saltiness and the sharpness of it is going to help stand up to the density of the potatoes. Now, you could also use something like a Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, which personally I think is the cheese of the gods, but it has a little bit softer, nuttier note to it when we talk about Parmigiano Reggiano. When we talk about that pecorino, it's a sheep's milk cheese, so that sharpness that's going to come from that sheep's milk is really going to help stand up to the density of the potatoes, as I mentioned. So we've got our flavors mixed in, and what we're going to do next is we're going to work in our egg. Okay. And you really want to get that egg mixture incorporated as much as possible so that you get evenly distributed amongst all the potato. And so we have our base now. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to start to work in our flour. Now, you may have heard of a term called the well method. Now, that's the hand method for making pasta, fresh pasta. Now, in my mind, I imagine my Nona standing in front of a large wooden cutting board with a mountain of flour in front of her, and then adding the eggs to kind of that volcano top, and then gradually working that egg to develop the dough itself. We're gonna do kind of a take on that, but it's gonna be kind of in the reverse method. So instead of gradually adding our egg to the flour, we're gonna gradually add our flour into our dough mixture. So we wanna make sure that we add this in spurts. Like I said, we're gonna need about a cup or so of flour to go along with the cup of potato, but we're gonna add it in gradually because it's all about feel. Now, as a chef, you need to get familiar with the consistencies that you're working with regard to your food. So that way, when you're working with it and you're working off of, when you don't have a recipe right there in front of you, you're able to mimic what you have on hand and you're able to get it right every single time. So we got our dough started a little bit. I'm gonna take it out onto our cutting board here. Just gonna flour the surface so nothing sticks. And now we're just gonna work in that flour. And really what we're looking for is a Play-Doh type consistency for our dough. You really wanna have an image of sort of a little pillows of love. That's the way that I refer to the gnocchis. Now, so you wanna make sure that you're not overworking it, because as we start to fold in our flour, what we're generating is something called gluten. Now, I know everyone watching is probably very, very familiar with the term gluten. It's literally written on just about every single food that's out there. I'm pretty sure even Waters has a label that says gluten-free on it on some variation there, shape, or form. But when we talk about gluten, that's really the structural integrity of pasta and really the structural integrity of what we're making. So the more that we work this dough, the more gluten we're actually going to generate. And so when we talk about the mouthfeel of this, we want it to be light and fluffy and airy. And so we want it to have some structural integrity. We don't want it to be a bowl of mashed potatoes, obviously. But when we talk about overworking the dough, that's the generation of too much gluten. So the more you work this, the more gluten's gonna form. And if you do it too much, your dough is gonna end up getting tough. And that's the last thing that we want. So our dough is coming together really nicely. Like I said, you really want it to kind of take on a Play-Doh effect, or if you've ever worked with like a sugar cookie dough, that's a really good kind of version to have. But like I said, you really want to work in just about a cup of flour gradually. And one key that I actually use to know that the dough is right is when you first start to work with it, you're gonna feel that residual moisture from the potatoes coming out against your hand. And so what I typically do is I'll add flour till I stop feeling that excess water coming out of it. And so that's a really key indicator that you've got the right amount of flour worked into your dough, okay? And so we're just about there. Our dough is coming together perfectly, and I'm just going to set it off to the side very quickly. Gonna put some more flour down on our board, and now I'm gonna show you how to go about rolling out our gnocchis themselves. So we've got a decent chunk here, so we're gonna do fairly uniform pieces if we can. Just gonna roll out 2 of these or so. Okay. So we're just gonna use the flour on our board and we're gonna gently roll out our gnocchis. Now, what I typically like to do is roll them out to about 1 inch or so in diameter. You don't want them to be too much thicker than that. Just for the cooking time on it, you want them to cook properly. But the most important element is having some uniformity in terms of the shape and the size of your gnocchis from the start, because the size of your gnocchi is going to impact the cooking time. And if you have inconsistency in terms of the size and the shape of your gnocchis, that's going to impact ultimately the cooking time. So you'll have some that cook really quickly if they're too small, and others that take a while. So you'll end up with different cooking times, and that's the last thing that you want. And so we've got our gnocchi rolled out really well, just what we're looking for. Like I said, about 1 inch to 1/2 inch in diameter. Doesn't need to be too much bigger than that. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna cut them into little bite-sized pieces, okay? Perfect. Now, one trick I want to show you all, now this isn't necessarily something that you have to do, but in a lot of restaurants, what they'll actually use is a gnocchi board, which is a small piece of wood that's got some ridges in it, and they'll actually roll the gnocchis down that board. Puts a little decorative flair to the dumplings themselves, but also helps generate a vehicle to hold more sauce, which as somebody eating in a restaurant, the whole idea with pasta is to get sauce onto it. So having a little bit easier vessel to get that sauce into your mouth is always a good idea. But one kind of quick trick to be able to do that if you don't have a gnocchi board is you can literally just use a regular kitchen fork. And then what you do is you take your gnocchis and you roll it right down the end of the fork. And it really puts a little bit of a decorative shape onto it. You can see that. So we've got our gnocchis all cut up and ready to go. We're just going to set them off to the side, let them rest for a little bit. Now, one thing I really love about fresh gnocchi is that they actually freeze really well. So now that our gnocchis are all ready to go and we got them resting over to the side, now we're gonna jump into the sauce that we're going to be making today. Now, gnocchi is a pretty blank canvas in terms of the things that you can do with it. You can play with a lot of different flavor profiles. You could do a pesto sauce with this. You could do a nice fresh tomato sauce for the summertime, or you can take it a little bit more, on the heavier side by doing sort of an Alfredo type sauce. And we're gonna do kind of a quick variation on an Alfredo sauce. It's summertime, so we are gonna make it a little bit lighter than the heaviness that kind of comes with an Alfredo sauce, but it will be a light cream sauce. And so what I'd like to do is take you through our ingredients that we have over here. For the sauce, we're actually gonna start off with just some simple vegetable oil. Now, in this recipe, you could use a number of different oils or fats to start off with. You could use butter if you want to, or olive oil, but for me personally, I like using just a straight vegetable oil for this type of dish because it's a neutral flavor, and we really want our aromatics to shine through on this dish. And so when we talk about our aromatics, we're referring to the small diced red onion that we have here. And we also have some minced garlic as well that's going to serve as our flavor profiles and our aromatics for the dish. Really gonna set a nice tone and a nice base for the flavors. We've also got some quartered yellow cherry tomatoes. One of my all-time favorite snacks in the summer is a beautiful yellow tomato. There's just something just remarkable about it to me. But they're gonna bring some amazing sweetness to this dish, as well as some much needed acidity. The acidity in the tomato is going to help balance out the heaviness of the cream. So it's gonna go a long way in doing that. And then we also have our pecorino romano, which we used earlier on. As I mentioned before, it's going to add a sharpness to our dish that's gonna help stand up to the density of the potato. Now, when we talk about this cheese, we used it in the beginning, so we want to use it in our sauce. We want our flavor profiles to build from start to finish. We don't want to start off with a random cheese and then finish with something later. We want them to be pretty cohesive throughout the whole thing. And then last but not least, we'll be using heavy cream in this, which I'll talk through why we're choosing heavy cream as opposed to possibly milk or half and half once we get to that point in the process. So we'll begin by getting our pan ready to go. I've already got my pot of pasta water broiling and boiling over here as well. As I mentioned before, season like the sea. You want to make sure that you add enough salt to it so that it tastes like the ocean, because that's going to incorporate the seasoning into our gnocchis once we cook them in just a bit. But the type of cream sauce that we're going to be making today is a pan sauce. A pan sauce differs greatly from a lot of other sauces because it's done a la minute. And when we talk about a la minute, we're really talking about something that's done to order. And when we're in a restaurant working on the line, going through service, this is something that needs to come together quickly and something that needs to get put together so that it can get out to the customer as soon as possible. The other side of that is also the freshness. So it's a very important balance between those two areas. You want it quick and you want it fresh and you want it to complement what you're making. As I touched on briefly before, one of the other variations of a cream sauce would be something like an Alfredo sauce or strictly a bechamel sauce. When we talk about a bechamel sauce, very different because you're actually using a roux to thicken it. With this, we're just going to be doing a straight reduction. So to start off with things, we're going to just add in our vegetable oil. You really just want enough to be able to coat the bottom of the pan. Okay. Get that going around. Now we want our pan at about a medium-high heat. We don't want it to be too high. And as a chef, we really want to utilize all of our senses when we're doing our cooking. Obviously our sense of taste, our sense of smell is important, but we also want to listen. So when we add our onions to this pan, you can kind of hear that sizzle coming out of the pan. And it's a little bit harsh right now, so I'm going to turn down the heat just a little bit, but it's right about where we want it to be in terms of the hiss coming out of the pan. So like I said, using all of your senses as a chef is truly important. So we're going to sweat these down a bit. And when we talk about the word sweating, what we're referring to is pulling out moisture and pulling out the natural sugars from an aromatic. And with onions, they possess a lot of aromatic flavor. They really bring in a lot of sweetness and a lot of spiciness in a lot of ways from their areas. So we're going to add a little bit of salt and pepper to this, not too much. We're using that salt as a flavor enhancer. And so now we're sweating down our onions, and what we're doing in this process is actually pulling out moisture and pulling out the natural sugars and aromas from our red onions themselves. And so by doing that, that's going to help us build our flavor profiles. And when we talk about sweating, it's a much different process to caramelizing vegetables. When we caramelize, we're literally cooking the sugars that exist in our aromatics. When we talk about sweating, we're just trying to pull them out. So very different elements when we talk about our cooking doneness with regard to our vegetables. Now, we've let our onions start out first for just a little bit. We let them go for about a minute or so before I went ahead and added our garlic. Now, the reason that I waited to put our garlic into our onions is due to the simple fact that there's more natural sugar in garlic than there is in onions. So by the time our onions were cooked properly, if we added them in at the same time, by the time our onions were cooked properly, our garlic will be burnt to the bottom of the pan. And so that's not what we're looking for. We want things to stay intact. We want those flavors. We want those aromas to come out. And so now that we've got our onions and garlic sweated down, really after you add your garlic in, should only be in the pan for about 30 seconds to a minute or so, just till you start to smell those aromatics perfuming out of the pan. Once those are ready to go, we're going to go ahead and add in our cherry tomatoes. So get those in there. We're going to season these as well. We really want to focus on seasoning as we go. And once we get to the end, we're going to taste our seasoning and see if we need to add anything to it. But in this instance, what we're looking to do is, again, cook down these tomatoes. As I mentioned before, the elements of these tomatoes are going to bring a lot of nice sweetness to this dish, but they're also going to bring that much needed acidity that's going to help balance out the fattiness of the cream and the heaviness on the palate. And so that's why this really works as a summertime dish potentially, because of that fresh fruit that we're adding, the fresh tomatoes. They really liven up the dish, they lighten it, and turn it into a much different experience than, say, a heavy Alfredo type sauce. So very simple way to utilize a nice cream dish, but do it in a little bit lighter way that allows it to be a little bit more versatile. All right, so we've cooked down our tomatoes a bit. We've cooked them for about 2 to 3 minutes or so. Let them condense, let them reduce down a bit. And what that's going to do is concentrate our flavors. You know, we don't want to just throw in these ingredients at random paces, throw them all in together and let them do their thing. We want to build our stages. We want to build our flavor profiles. So every time that we add something to this, we're looking to fill the pot and we're looking to build things up together. So very important to let those tomatoes cook down, let those juices incorporate with our aromatics nicely. So now that we've got that perfect, we're going to go ahead and add in our heavy cream. Now you just want to add enough to be able to cover the bottom of the pan. Okay, perfect. Okay, and here is where we can turn up our heat a little bit. Now, an important thing to note about working with a cream sauce and really, just working with heavy cream in general is that, as I said before, it can be very heavy on the palate. That's one of the main reasons, as I said before, why we chose the fat to start off with that we did. Using butter would be somewhat redundant in this because, well, I had a chef here at the school once that used to say to us over and over again, butter is cream and cream is butter, and he told us to think about that. We weren't really sure what he meant at the beginning, but understanding that fat and fat is just the same thing. So when we talk about cream and butter, very similar elements, but so we don't want to overdo it with that. So now that we've got our cream going into our pan, I turned up our heat a bit, and we really want to cook this down. So what we're looking to do is reduce down the cream to a consistency called nappe, which means the ability for it to coat the back of a spoon. Again, we want to focus on condensing those flavors and letting things come together. You know, we're not making a bowl of cereal here. We don't want things to be separate. We want them to be all cohesive, and we want it to be able to cling to the gnocchis that we're going to make. We went through all that time to prep our dough properly and build our beautiful gnocchis. We really want to make sure that we have a nice, decently thick sauce to cling to our dumplings themselves. Now, one thing I will note, as I said before, you could potentially use half and half if you wanted to for this, as well as potentially use just cream. But the problem with those, especially with the half and half, is that if you cook them at too high a temperature, they have a tendency to separate, especially with the half and half, because you're literally dealing with part milk and part heavy cream, and when those milk solids separate, and they actually will get kind of chunky in your sauce, once that product separates, become very displeasing to the palate and really doesn't work very well. Using heavy cream is obviously more expensive and obviously higher in fat and calories and whatnot, but really it's a much better eatability with regard to the quality of your sauce. It's going to come down nicely. It allows you to work at a higher temperature, and just a much better experience for your customer. And so while our sauce finishes coming down, we've already got our pasta water ready to go. Gonna go ahead and get our gnocchis in, so that way these all can kind of finish together at the same time. Okay. Now, one of the beautiful things about working with dumplings is that they will literally tell you when they're done. Once they've cooked all the way through, they literally will float right to the surface. Now, as a chef, there's very few foods in this world that will literally tell you when they're done. So we always take those when we get that opportunity. So we're gonna let those go for just a little bit. They shouldn't take more than a minute or so. Our sauce is coming together really nicely. It's starting to come down. I'm going to test our seasoning here. Pretty good there. We're gonna add a little bit more salt here. But we wanna leave some room for the cheese that we're gonna add in just a little bit. Now, if you wanna come over here, you'll see that we've already got our gnocchi starting to float. You can see how quickly that starts to happen. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get those out of the water. Okay. Perfect. Our little pillows of love, as I like to say. So our gnocchis are perfect. Our sauce is all ready to go, so we're ready to plate. We're not going to do a full entree portion for this, so obviously it would work perfectly well as a full meal, but we're just going to do an appetizer size portion for this. A little bit of this will definitely go a long way, as you know, the density of the potatoes is very rich, as well as the sauce. Just get this plated up nicely here. We're gonna finish it with a little bit more cheese, because as I always like to say, cheese never hurt nobody. And there you have it. Beautiful fresh gnocchi. Enjoy it.